Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Peter Hayes, who is Executive Director of the Nautilus Institute for Security and Sustainable Development, a non-governmental policy-oriented research and advocacy group based in Berkeley, California. Peter, welcome to Berkeley. Well, Berkeley is your home, so I said,
it's good to be back home,
yes,
is what I would say.
That's right. Where were you born and raised?
I was actually born in Australia, in southern Australia in Melbourne, and I guess spent the first years of my life on a dairy farm. So I actually know all about farming and getting up early in the morning and sort of seasonal cycles. I first met death in the Australian bush as a very young boy walking around in the bush by myself, and came across a pond with a dead kangaroo in it. I'll never forget that.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, they were very political. They were actually agricultural scientists who, after World War II, had gone farming on what were called soldier settlements. This was basically a land grant to a returned soldier. But most farmers in Australia are not agricultural scientists, obviously. Most of them grew up on a farm and inherited it and keep farming. So they came really out of a relatively intellectual background in the city and went farming. And so this was during the mid-1960s when I had my first real memories of being on the farm. Was in the midst of the Vietnam War. And so they were opposed to the war, and I remember quite distinctly that we were suddenly uninvited to go to the annual tennis tournament on the largest farm in the area. They always staged it there. They were the sort of rural aristocracy. And then after that, my parents, especially my mother, became very leading figures in the what was called the Western Port Protection Council, which is like, say, San Francisco Bay Association. And the Premier of our state had declared that Western Port Bay, which is at that point was a pristine, very beautiful estuarine system, was destined to become the Ruhr of the Southern Hemisphere. And Premier Bolte did not realize that he was up against my mother. And in fact, she brought it pretty much to a screeching halt over the subsequent decade. But along the way went, wrecked fences, locals who felt they were not going to get jobs who would cut fences, and death calls on, death threats on the phone, that kind of stuff. So we grew up in for a farm, I mean, it was 365 days a year, get up and milk the cows. Right. Which put my parents under tremendous pressure because I was one of 4 kids as well, so they were also parenting 4 kids. But it was a relatively political sort of socialization for a farm kid.
So in terms of education, it was somewhat natural that you would move into the combination of environment and activism, but you took a detour to history, right? You did your undergraduate work in history.
Well, I was always interested, obviously, well, not obviously, but I was always gripped by history and did my undergraduate degree, pardon me, with what you would call here a major in history, although I also did a secondary in the history and philosophy of science and actually in Indian studies. And then that whole trajectory was kind of rudely interrupted by politics because I went overseas and spent nearly 2 years in France organizing protests against the French nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere over Mureaux Atoll, pardon me, which is where I was very lucky to intersect with a person who became later a political mentor, Brice Lalonde, who was a key figure in the 1968 student revolution at the Sorbonne and was the founder of Friends of the Earth and later Les Amis de la Terre in Paris, and later became ecological candidate for the presidency. He's quite a famous figure now in France. And Brice really taught me an enormous amount about politics, of the politics of that era. And when I went back to Australia, I was then deeply involved with the establishment of the national environmental movement, which in Australia had a very green-red content. We were working closely with the trade union movement, direct action of trade unions to stop the destruction of inner city areas or heritage areas, but then trade union action to stop the destruction of wilderness. So almost inconceivable in the United States, this kind of relationship between the green movement and the working folks organizations, which in Australia were led by the Builders Labourers Federation. But it was actually that connection, certainly, that first took me to China, interestingly. In 75, the Builders Labourers Federation in Melbourne in Australia were Maoist, hardline, hardcore Maoists. Also corrupt as hell, but that's another story. And in Sydney, they were led by the non-aligned Communist Party, the Australian Nationalist Communist Party, and both were competing for the constituency represented by the New Green movement that was, a classic social movement, bottom up. And they didn't really know how to corral this energy, but they wanted to. So the BLF in Melbourne set up a trip to China to try and somehow shift the Greens into the Maoist camp of the left. And so I ended up in April of 75 in China for my first trip to China. Mao Zedong was still alive. And we were all incredibly, I think, impressed with China, distressed with the government in China, and came back with exactly the opposite lesson learned that the Maoists in Australia wanted us to learn.
Yeah, I see.
But just, I'll never forget, we went way north and up into the inner Gobi Desert, looking at the sand dune, stabilization work of the local peasants. And for a young farm boy, this was quite a fast kind of track to get some knowledge about Asia.
But yeah, and along the way, you were also picking up graduate degree here at Berkeley, so you got a PhD in energy and resources.
Well, actually, there was a short interlude, wasn't that short, but I went to Nairobi for Friends of the Earth International. After working with Les Amis de la Terre, I was involved with founding Friends of the Earth in Australia, and that led us to connect with Dave Brower from Berkeley, the founder of Friends of the Earth USA, and a key figure in the international. FO is now in about 30 countries, I think. And I was persuaded by FO International to go to Nairobi and set up the Environment Liaison Center, which is the gateway or the entry portal for non-governmental organizations to the UN Environment Program, which is headquartered in Nairobi. So this was sort of directly continuous with the environmental work. But then after I left that after a year, I said I would go for 1 year to set it up, and then I was an acceptable candidate between the North and the South to setting up that entry point, which the consultative status international NGOs did not want to happen because they control the access to the UN. This was open access, a real innovation. But I said I'd be there for a year, and as an acceptable candidate to the North and the South, and I'd be out of there. So I came back through the United States, going back to Australia, and visited the Energy and Resources Group, which was the only, which was very attractive to me because there was nothing like it in Australia. You could do social science to the nth degree here, and you could do the technical side. And I was equally interested in the ecological science, environmental side, the engineering side, and there was no program in Australia that came close. So I was very lucky to get admitted here, but in order to actually then come to campus, I actually had to go back to Australia and complete my first degree. I got admitted to Berkeley before I'd finished my first degree, so I went back and did that. And then came back to the United States. So you've just described a very interesting mix of political activism, involvement with the environment, education, and so on. So let's reflect a little on this. What are the key skills required for doing political activism in an NGO in an age of globalization? Well, I think the first sort of operating rule is essentially to be fearless. And that means intellectually fearless as well as politically fearless. It means asking the really hard questions and not accepting glib answers and not accepting no for an answer. You keep on asking the question until you find a pathway to a solution. It may be a very difficult pathway, there may be multiple pathways, but there is a pathway to a solution. The status quo is not simply inevitable. And if you take that position, you can then go in any number of sort of angles of difficulty, from extremely ideal positions to very marginal shifts from current policy as your angle of approach. You've got enormous choice within there, but that's the first basic decision, is to not accept the status quo, ever. And then, having taken that critical position, you then have to have really deep research skills if you're going to do something about the status quo. Because the research skills are what enables you to survey the terrain, understand the dynamics of the problem, and figure out the multiple pathways to a solution. I mean, you know from history, and you know from political practice, you know from just being alive, that going from A to B in human activity is never a straight line. You may plan to go from here to there in a straight line, but you will always be ambushed by uncertainty. So that's the one thing you know, is you won't go the way that you think you're going to go. So there are probably more than one ways, is the corollary of that. And you'll only really understand that and be able to conceptualize a strategy if you have really deep research skills. And then the second really important skill, I think, to have an initiative that has real impact in the real world, is to have an outreach and publicity strategy that can communicate your views, information that is essential to the various parties involved in the problem, who are antagonists or involved in trying to solve a problem. And most importantly, in the modern context, create a network where you can communicate in a way that creates a stock of common knowledge. And if you can create that network, and the internet is really integral to this in the 21st century, you can actually align perceptions across political cultures, across political boundaries, and you can create a kind of new information milieu. It's a kind of an agenda-setting strategy where you're very careful not to dominate the information milieu or even attempt to saturate it. In fact, the less you say, the more powerful your voice, because if you sort of drop it in the pond once a year, everyone notices, because you're kind of the convener of this information space. And you can have an enormous impact by doing that. And then the third critical skill, I think, is however you do it, you have to be ready for surprise. You have to be looking for uncertainty. You have to embrace uncertainty, because when you know where the uncertainties lie, where the ambushes lie, where the positive surprises lie, they're the leverage points. You can have enormous leverage if you can get to one of those tipping points first and not be surprised by it, be ready to actually exploit it. We use a Nautilus scenarios methodology to do that, but there are a number of ways to do it. But we're always looking ahead for surprise. And after all, what does uncertainty represent to anyone who's monomaniacal about their mission of problem solving, whatever the problem is, other than reintroducing all the relationships of all the problems to each other? That's what you're being surprised by. You know, you're focused on this problem, you think you understand it, and you go, you know, a long way down that path to a solution, and then suddenly, wham, you hit from the side. And usually that comes from an interrelationship with a proximate problem. So you're recognizing that really there's an ecology of problems, just like there's an ecology of life. And that's not surprising that all these issues are seamlessly interrelated. And it does actually push you to be somewhat humble about the likelihood that you're going to have a really big impact. Because what it says is, that logic is, if you really focus on your own problem and you drive everything to succeed to solve that problem, you're going to create a lot of turbulence for all the people trying to solve the problems that are interrelated to yours and close by. And so the best way to solve a problem is probably not to actually solve your own problem, but promulgate the experience and the tools that you use in your problem areas to others who are working on other problems. And that way you can raise the whole tide of problem solving and reduce the limiting conditions that everyone has working in their own domain. Mm-hmm. And so it's really those three skills: deep research, information systems, communication, mm-hmm. and creation of new kinds of knowledge, new kinds of public goods, if you like, information public goods, and orchestrating a strategy that recognizes all those interrelationships that are key to being successful.
And where do you derive your value orientation? In other words, applying this formula to international life in a way, mm-hmm. in a globalized world. Obviously there's a commitment to the environment, mm-hmm. which comes from your background and
right.
and one knows from your work. What other sorts of values drive the enterprise?
Well, I mean, sustainability is of course about intergenerational equity. It's about the environmental values that really frame our existence as a species. And so that's a pretty core value to me, intergenerational equity. But along the way, I think you also have the concept of peace. Now, in the name of the Institute, we have security and sustainability.
Mm-hmm. And we should say that the institute that you're head of is the Nautilus Institute, based in Berkeley,
right.
which is an NGO essentially implementing a lot of the strategies that you're talking
right.
about. Yeah,
that's right. But in many of the activities that we undertake, we talk about peace and security. We had a long debate at one mm-hmm. point with our donors as to whether we could, in this culture, in this strategic culture, dealing with nuclear weapons, talk about peace and security, or just about security. Well, we're already so far off the spectrum if we started talking about peace. Was this just Berkeley and Quaker and mm-hmm. so forth? And we insisted that peace belongs there as a positive value. You make peace, you construct peace, brick by brick, human by human. Whereas security, conceived of primarily as the absence of war, is actually not peace. It's just a kind of static negative condition. Mm-hmm. The worst example of that, of course, is the balance of terror between states that are armed with nuclear weapons and could annihilate each other overnight. I've always found it hard to think of that as being secure. It may mm-hmm. be stable, mm-hmm. Which is another key value of the strategic community. Those who deal with military security is stability, but stability does not mean peace. So I think peace is very important, and those of us who grew up in the Vietnam War and those of us who have been in war zones, I think put that at a fairly high sort of value to work on. The third that is absolutely essential now in the current conditions of globalization, which is accelerating, is some measure of justice and equity, because we just cannot hope to achieve peace and sustainability in a world with the kind of gross, really extraordinary levels of inequality in income and wealth. And the fact that this is so ostentatious at this point, and you can be almost everywhere on the planet and observe it, means that it simply cannot be ignored. Mm-hmm. And so that creates just a huge pressure on borders, which I see as being the antithesis of nuclear weapons. I sort of see nuclear weapons at one end being the ultimate sort of state assertion of territorial sovereignty and control of a border and cross-border movement, information, people, goods, etc. And at the other end you have border crossing, which is the exact antithesis of nuclear weapons and brings with it enormous potential for creating peace and security. And the faster we can dissolve borders, as far as I'm concerned, the better. I'm, for that reason, sort of genetically in favor of migration, aside from being myself a border crosser and having now a family where I'm married to a Ukrainian American with an adopted child from the Philippines and another adopted child from Guatemala. So we're a little UN of four nationalities, and a family of 4. My kids have 3 passports.
I see.
Each.
That's a good statement against borders and boundaries.
Although they say they're from Berkeley when you ask them.
Oh, I see. That explains everything. I know that you, in your work in the last decade and more, and your institute have, as one of the subtopics that you've worked on, have been dealing with North Korea. So this, talking a little about North Korea and the projects you've been involved in will probably help us understand how you've implemented this, on the one hand, these strategies for doing work in today's world, and on the other hand, the values that you've talked about. So in your establishing relations on a project level with North Korea must have been very difficult, given the climate in which you started. You probably started this when the Cold War was still on.
That's
basically,
right.
yeah.
Right.
So tell us a little about the energy project that you've had there, and how it's been a reflection of what we've just talked about.
Well, I have to say this actually was, the real genesis of this work was actually right here on campus. And 2 people played a very key role in it. One was John Holdren, the founder of the Energy and Resources Group, and the other was Franz Sherman, a well-known sociologist and historian here. And I say that because really, John was, as a mentor, at one point when I was studying here in that program, sort of bopped me on the head and made me recognize as an activist intellectual, if you like, that there is a point at which you have to make a political decision. Are you working at the margin on policy, or are you working in social movements to transform the context in which policy is made? Now, in the internet world, you can actually do both simultaneously. But at that point, you sort of had to choose. And even today, you have to choose somewhat. Are you working at the margin on policy, or are you working just to create, just transform the underlying conditions of what is possible? And the genesis of the work was actually originally in creating a social movement in the Pacific called the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement, for which we wrote a book called American Lake Nuclear Peril in the Pacific. And that was very much aimed at increasing, for example, the protests that would go out and greet American and Soviet, then Soviet warships as they sailed in and out of the ports of the region. This led to the nuclear-free zone in New Zealand that led to the rupture of the Australian-New Zealand-US alliance, for example. So it was very much a grassroots organizing strategy, but we, as analysts, would often try to bring to the attention of these activists things that were unpleasant truths. For example, that if you're in favor of evicting the United States from the Philippines and Okinawa, then you better be working on Korea, because they are stepping stones to a war in Korea. And there's no way in hell you're going to get the United States out of those bases, at least not easily, without also attending to Korea. And ditto for the Koreans, who are very introspective. You better pay attention to these folks who are working on the rear bases that are used for reinforcing contingency in the Korean peninsula if you want to be effective. Now, in that book, we discovered that the only place that you could actually start a nuclear war in Asia Pacific was Korea. That was the Tripwire. And that was kind of a throwaway few pages in a very long book about the whole region. And from there, I then drilled in my dissertation, actually, here, into the issue of American nuclear weapons in South Korea in great depth. History, force posture, doctrine, or what passed for doctrine, the North Korean story, etc. And that got us deeply involved got me deeply involved in South Korea at a time when social movements were rising in protest and then ultimately overthrew the military dictatorship in South Korea. If you remember, in the summer of '87, when Seoul was under a cloud of tear gas, and that really got us deeply involved in Korea. Got me deeply involved in Korea, and it was only after that, having built that reputation in South Korea, because that work was quite notorious at the time, that the North Koreans took any notice of our existence. And I was actually invited to go there. I'd actually by that point gone back to Australia and was working for the Australian government and the Commission for the Future, a long-term strategic think tank. And I would get a cable, what was then a cable, I guess you'd call it a telex, a telegram, from Pyongyang, each year saying, please come and talk to us about nuclear weapons. And I was always interested, so I'd write back, and the first one would always be sent by mistake to Seoul by the post office, so bounce back and say, no, Pyongyang, different country. And they'd send it off. And then finally in 91, I sent back this telegram, and within days I got a reply saying, come, and come now. And so I went, because how many times do you get a chance to go to North Korea and talk about nuclear weapons? And that was really where I was able to establish a personal relationship with some North Koreans who are very senior in the regime. And that's very Korean. Politics is all about a personal relationship. And so it's on that very slender thread that really all our work in Korea, especially North Korea, has hung since then. We've been to North Korea, built a wind power project in a North Korean village, a starving, famine-afflicted North Korean village. We're still in that village after 6 or 7 years. We run an information service that connects the policy-making community in Pyongyang, China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Russia, the United States, and then everywhere else on the planet that there are people working on that issue. We have them wired. We give them a daily report where we have feeds of the latest news from each country, and it goes out to everyone, so everyone can instantly see what's being said in the other political culture. And then we run deep research on the energy situation, the nuclear security, and other aspects of security. So we've created a kind of reference site. And now we actually do scenarios of Korea, which we did it last year, we'll do it again this year, where we explicitly look for big surprises. And last year's scenarios exercise, in 3 out of 4 scenarios, we predicted there would be a confrontation this year with the United States. And that's pretty much what happened. And we felt quite prepared when things fell apart. We'd already thought through, what do we need to do now?
And what, building on this experience and this base of knowledge and this set of interactions, let's try to talk a little about U.S. interests in that region, in what is obviously a very great period of transition for U.S. foreign policy, but on the other hand, for places like North Korea that seem to be reaching out, at a time when they're being labeled rogue states, basically, and being put in a category which they may or may not want. So first, what are American interests in today in that part of the world?
Well, for many decades, American vital interests in the region have been well defined as being essentially stability, by which is meant not having a war, and no proliferation of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, and then to foster inter-Korean reconciliation, not reunification, but reconciliation. And then after September the 11th, the issue of the war on terrorism, and specifically the link between the risks of WMD, or weapons of mass destruction, falling into terrorist hands or the hands of a terrorist state, and North Korea became very central to American foreign policy in this region, and that sort of pole vaulted over the other 3 objectives to the top. So now stability is subordinated to weapons of mass destruction, which is linked to the war on terrorism at the top, and then way down the bottom is inter-Korean reconciliation. So they're the fundamental sort of rank hierarchy of American interests that are driving this administration.
And what about North Korea? What are their interests as they see it?
Well, their first and foremost interest is regime survival. Now, until about a month ago, until about April of 2003, their second objective, I think, was to get an economy to sustain their conventional military. And then their third objective was to obtain weapons of mass destruction. I think after the war with Iraq, that has now flipped, So it appears that weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear weapons, are now second place in their hierarchy because they're pretty sure, A, they need those to stop the United States attacking North Korea, and B, they've recognized that under the Bush administration there's almost zero chance of striking a deal where they would get an economy in return for giving up their nuclear weapons. And so they've had to make a fundamental choice, and they appear to have made it, although things are hanging in the balance as we speak, so things could change.
In following your work, one gets the sense that you really believe that if you're going to change things without going to war, that you really have to follow this formula you mentioned before, namely linking peace to security and both to economic development. Now, how does that play in this context? In other words, how has the energy project that you and your institute have developed, how does that fit into this dynamic of working towards solutions in the context of a larger set of problems?
Well, with that set of 4 strategic goals that the United States has, there are really 3 basic strategies that it can adopt. One is it can engage a kind of internationalist strategy, attempt to define ways of cooperating, especially economic, that enable the North Koreans to have an economy, recover economically, stabilize the situation in their country, and create all kinds of interdependencies and reciprocities so that they have a stake in the status quo. That would be the essence of an internationalist or engagement strategy. The second basic strategy is militant containment. Basically, we attempt to deter them from attacking us, and we might do some other things to basically keep them at arm's length, and we might talk to them just to keep things stable at a certain time or manage crises, but we're not attempting to really engage them. And then the third is to actually just roll them back. Now, American foreign policy has always been, these elements are always present, especially in relation to Korea. We started with a rollback policy, trying to destroy North Korea in the Korean War. We then were pushed back to a militant containment posture. We're still really in a militant containment posture. We had an element of engagement injected in the 90s under the Clinton administration that was pretty much demolished by the Bush administration, and now they're being forced to consider whether they in fact have to use engagement to solve this problem, because rollback looks too hard and militant containment won't achieve their objective, because if the North Koreans get nukes, they might in fact export them, and in an era of global terrorism that's not acceptable. So where does a small NGO like us fit into this? Well, first of all, we can collect data on the ground if we have access about what's really going on that you can't get from satellite photos, and you can't get by just talking across the table in some third country.
You mean information about the economy and
yeah, sure. I mean, for example, we actually measure the electric power grid in our village, and we do it continuously. We have records stored in a digital readout system. So when policymakers in Seoul or in Washington or elsewhere are thinking about their options, we can tell them things about North Korea that they need to know. For example, there are actually 2 grids in North Korea operating on different frequencies. And this has enormous implications for the light water reactors that the United States and its coalition partners are building in North Korea, because it tells you can't operate those reactors in the North Korean grid. That's impossible from an engineering perspective. So either you're building something that will never operate, you better know that, because there's going to be a rude surprise when you hand over the key to the North Koreans, or you better start building some regional tie lines to give grid supplement from Russia or China or South Korea. So we've held 2 workshops already on that topic, brought that issue to the attention of policymakers. That workshop has enabled North and South Koreans to come together, so we're fostering the reconciliation, peacemaking process. And then meanwhile, in the country, we have an open channel right under the radar screen. It's very difficult. And we often talk about moving mountains when we're on the telephone, when they're in Beijing, or we meet in a third country, like we met late last year in Italy, in Como. We have to move mountains in Pyongyang, we have to move mountains in Washington. There may be time lags, but eventually we get things aligned, We get our permissions from our uppers, that's what they call them in Pyongyang, the uppers, and we're able to send a mission into North Korea, into this village, to deliver new batteries to make the wind turbines work and deliver power to the village. Or they come to China for a study tour, or they come here. So that's really how it works. It's keeping open lines of communication and also helping them just begin the very early tasks of creating their own civil society. That country has never intersected with the West. They don't know what the universal values of human rights, what the norms are. There's just no historical experience, none. In 5,000 years, they've just never intersected with it. So we're starting from scratch. So things like basic trainings in Geneva on human rights, basic trainings in the lingo of arms control. What is this thing called arms control? And monitoring. What is monitoring? Transparency. Transparency? I mean, what is transparency to a North Korean? So you have to explain all this from scratch. A lot of training. Every step there's training. And they in turn have to give access and information. There is a quid pro quo. It's explicit. And there are red lines. If we don't deliver on our commitments, they walk. If they don't deliver on their commitments, we walk. And you have to be ready to confront that issue.
And what is the greatest obstacle for moving from what you're achieving at the local level in the energy field to the more strategic level, you know, at which the two parties, North Korea and the United States, for whatever reason, are calling each other names and are essentially almost locked in their own silos that prevent this kind of communication when they're interacting at that level?
Well, the essence of our work in North Korea is to demonstrate the way that one can successfully jointly do business. And there are certain lessons learned about that. One is that you have to understand their political culture. And if you begin a negotiation by insulting their leader, it's unlikely that you'll be able to recover for some time and actually then have until you can have a useful conversation. So some really basic cultural attributes that these smaller scale projects, you know, have lessons for big picture diplomacy. Another would be if you, at the very outset, decide that you're going to build gargantuan projects based on intergovernmental instrumentalities, that you're going to rely on governments and huge bureaucracies to deliver, and more than one at a time, so there's lots of transactions costs. Between adversaries, you can almost guarantee that there's going to be a lot of unpleasantness along the way, and you're never actually going to succeed. At the end of the day, you're going to have 20 million extremely frustrated and angry North Koreans because you never delivered, and you're going to have hundreds of millions of angry and frustrated Chinese, American, Japanese, South Koreans, etc., angry at the North Koreans. So our simple lesson learned is, if you're going to engage that country, do it right. Deliver lots of cheap things very quickly in lots of places at the same time. Not so you overwhelm them, but so that people get tangible benefits really quickly. And then they believe. And then you take the next step. It may be a bigger and a harder next step. But if you start at this huge project level, as the governments did, you're almost doomed to failure.
Now, what is at the root, both historically and otherwise, in North Korea's misperceptions of the United States, and also on the other side, the misperceptions of the U.S. Of North Korea?
Well, I think there are certain perceptions and misperceptions that make it extremely difficult for the two sides to communicate. But actually, I'm not so sure that it's a misperception that's the problem, because I think they actually have their finger on our pulse quite well. They understand the United States quite well. At least the people I've talked to have a much better understanding of the United States than American leaders do of North Korea. And that's a bit of a problem from a negotiating stance if you're the United States. But there are really deep-seated fears and securities that are grounded in history. I mean, the United States did nuke 70,000 Koreans at Hiroshima, of whom about 50,000 died, and about 25,000 went back to the two Koreas. And in the North, those survivors are very revered members of the community. So they begin they weren't against those bombings. They, in fact, if you talk to them, say they wish the United States had used more nuclear weapons against Japan.
These were Korean prisoners?
These were Korean impressed laborers in the Japanese war effort. They happened to be under the bomb when it exploded at Hiroshima, and they had nowhere to evacuate. So they were the most afflicted by the fallout at Hiroshima. But the point I'm making is that from the beginning of the nuclear era, the Koreans, and especially the North Koreans, have literally had nuclear effects seared into their psyche, and then this was reinforced during the Korean War, and then through 5 decades of projected nuclear threat. And it was intended to have that effect. That's what deterrence meant at the time. They better understand. They put a toe over the line, they'll get nuked. But they understand that in a way that few people do, so they've built an underground society. I mean, what is above ground is epiphenomenal in North Korea. It takes a while to actually even see the underground North Korea, because you're just not used to looking for the signs of an underground society. It's really the only one on the planet. But they have gone underground as a result. So their way of viewing the world is totally alien to the American worldview, and their concept of political power is so antithetical to ours. Their one person, the leader, has all power, absolutely, and it's purely political. And here, power is impersonal, it's relative, it's divided constitutionally, and it's legal, and it's bureaucratic. And so how can these two political cultures communicate? And so given how difficult that is at the best of times, let alone at times of fear and loathing like now, I think it's very crucial that we have on-the-ground projects where some understandings have been reached by people of goodwill on each side, so there is some communication channel open. And up until 1989, it was actually regulation that no State Department diplomat would even talk to a North Korean. So if they met at the Swedish reception in Stockholm or whatever, an American diplomat was instructed to turn their back and walk away from a North Korean diplomat. And that's essentially the policy that the Bush administration has adopted. We will not talk to these people unless they capitulate. And of course, they're not capitulating. They're currently putting a nuclear gun to the American head and saying, talk, or we'll go nuclear.
So in what way can, going back to what you said, Holdren and your work here at Berkeley had taught you about working at the edge of policy versus, transforming the structure or environment of policy. How do you make that breakthrough in a context where the insecurity on both sides is becoming greater because of their perceptions and misperceptions of each other?
Well, remember I began by saying that the essence of this work is to be fearless. And one of the things you discover when you do really deep research on nuclear weapons, and you get to the inner sanctum, and you really look inside the inner sanctum, is you discover there's no one there. There are actually no real answers to the hard metaphysical questions that are posed by nuclear weapons. Essentially they exist and they're awesome, and that's really all you need to know. And you can sort of figure it out from there, what should be policy. The problem is that there are people who occupy bureaucracies all over the planet with their hands on these weapons who don't really know the answers either. So they're looking for some guidance as to what to do. And so what we can do is come up as independent thinkers and players is with innovative ideas that offer some alternatives to these people who are often gridlocked and don't like being gridlocked in their own stereotypes, trapped in their own stereotypes. Now, for an organization like ours, that means that if you're dealing with an issue, as we did recently, we released the Pentagon study from 1966 on the use of tactical nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War.
And this was by a group of scientists, the JACID group, who posed the question, well, what would happen if you use nuclear weapons?
Actually, the question was, what could you actually use them for? is there any utility in dealing with the National Liberation Front and the Viet Cong, the war on the ground? What's the military utility?
And this was generated because there was actually some discussion in the Pentagon about using, to change the course of the Vietnam War by using nuclear weapons.
Yeah, specifically what we discovered in doing the deep research to get at what was going on at that time, which was a long time ago, 1966, was the speculation that was going on in the Pentagon and the State Department about using nuclear weapons to shut down the Mugia Pass on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Because this is where the material was going south and it was killing Americans. The guerrillas were getting the stuff from the north and using it in the south. And they were getting very frustrated because the bombing had not shut down the pass. The B-52s and so forth had not shut down the pass. And that report, we could have just published it. We got this using Freedom of Information Act. And we could have just put it out and just sort of let historians deal with it. But we very explicitly set out to frame the release so that it would first of all be policy salient. So what was the underlying conclusion of these authors? What was really remarkable was that the Jasons told McNamara in the summer of '66, to be precise, in August, September '66, that if the United States used nuclear weapons, not only would they not shut down the Mugia Pass, because that actually wouldn't work physically, but the Viet Cong or some other insurgency was certain to get nuclear weapons one way or another, either in Vietnam or in some other war zone, and would use them against the United States. And the United States was reciprocally more vulnerable to their use. This is a very bad idea, they suggested. And that, in the current policy context of the war in Iraq, a pending war with North Korea, the situation with Syria, the situation in Pakistan and Kashmir, the situation with Al-Qaeda is extremely relevant. Now, we didn't then just set out to put out that message and highlight that note, although we did that. Rather, we set out to then engage analysts, both the original Jasons, all of whom are still alive, to speak with an authoritative voice, not just our little pipsqueak voice, but one of them is now a Nobel Prize winner, one is Freeman Dyson, he's a bigwig in this world at Princeton, very highly respected philosopher and scientist. But we then set out to get a point-counterpoint analysis of the salience of this argument about have nuclear weapons changed? Are they more tactically useful now? Do the arguments about insurgency still compute? The Al-Qaeda, the MAC franchising, if you like, of terrorism, is not the National Liberation Front. They're completely different. So, is the argument still salient? And so we went to very different political constituencies, sought analysts, solicited their input, and this was published along with our own views. And so this meant that the policy spectra saw us actually putting out the argument in a relatively objective fashion, so they could then consider this intellectually with some integrity, not just as a pre-digested, here's our wheelbarrow, we're pushing it. And so we've framed a space, if you like, an information space where this kind of discussion happens. And now that's an expectation. People come to us expecting to get that kind of insight. And so that makes it very policy relevant, but it also doesn't prejudge the policy outcome.
Now is the hope, because one of the brick walls that it would appear you come up against is the power of the media to define issues in a very narrow...
To be honest, it's the other way around. The media, we lead the media. I mean, the power of this strategy, our daily service goes out now to 40 countries and about 4,000 subscribers, and our survey shows that each subscriber, on average, forwards it to about 3.5 people. So there's somewhere around 10 to 12,000 readers. And we know that the New York Times Tokyo Bureau, the Wall Street Journal Beijing Bureau, the Washington Post folks, LA Times, we've got the media wide. They come to us. Newsweek, the whole NewsHour, CNN, NPR, they come to us and say, what does this story mean? I have a whole slew of calls today about North Korea and its reprocessing from journalists all around the planet. And I guarantee tonight they'll all be visiting our website to say, what on earth is going on? And we'll either be cited or the information and argument will appear in how they frame their essay. So actually, it's not that the media are the problem for us, although I think they are a problem for policy. It's that the higher you go in the policy apparatus, the more insulated those people are and are trapped by the ideologies and information systems, particularly the classified ones, that present them with their daily bread. And they're so short of time that it's very difficult to get them wired, although we've actually succeeded in doing that. We've found that the younger generation of policymakers who 10 years ago were just starting in their careers and were, of course, early adopters, have now risen to the assistant secretary level. And of course, if they can't get what we do at their desk at the State Department or the Pentagon or in Defense Intelligence Agency or the CIA or wherever they are located now, or in an embassy, they have their Hotmail account and they ask us to send it there and they check it at home. So we've often been told by ambassadors that the first thing they turn on in the morning on their computer is not the cable traffic. They go to our daily report because they get an instant cross-cut of what's going on in the region that they need to know about.
So, but to reach the very top, I guess the question becomes...
You have to go there and brief them.
You have to go there and brief them, but I guess the question is politics driven by ideology, by emotion, by the irrational elements,
right.
And how does this strategy succeed in overcoming that,
right.
basically? Is it by winning over larger segments of the policy community, or is it by convincing the general public?
Well, I actually think it's a bit of both, and you're not forced, as you were a decade ago, to choose in the same way between those constituencies in terms of the information systems. You are in terms of the content. You put out very different content for a policy options paper for someone facing a crisis today than you would for helping Korean Americans come to grips with their identity and U.S. foreign policy. Different kinds of issues, but they may be very influential in a particular electorate that may be very important in policy making on the Hill. So I don't have a very good answer for that. All I can say is that in our experience that you can shift perceptions both of the adversary and introduce innovative policy ideas at a very senior level in more than one capital city privy to the conflict or party to the conflict at once. And whether you actually succeed in shifting these ships of state 5 degrees from, or even 1 degree from their current course, so that they can slip through a channel between the reefs to the safety on the other side, if you pick exactly the right moment and you have just enough leverage, you don't need to shift them 180 degrees, just a few degrees to at least avert disaster, if not actually solve the problem. And there have been specific instances, I think, where we've played that kind of role. Very few, but perhaps very important.
One final question. I think that when one listens to you and as you talk about the work of your institute, there is a sense of hope emerges that the world can be changed, actually, in the right direction. So I'm curious, how would you advise students to prepare for this kind of work on the one hand, but on the other hand, retain that hope in what is a broader environment that is for most people frustrating and with less and less hope?
Well, all I can say is that wars do end, and peace is, in fact, constructed day by day in families and communities. And the conditions for peace, I think, are actually accelerating with globalization and with migration and with many aspects of modernity. And the old ways of doing business, which are about violence and domination, are really not acceptable either to civil society or to markets. And so this puts really enormous momentum on the side of the peacemaking process. And as states become weaker and weaker in relative terms, I think the problem will be how to deal with failing states. And I don't just mean the Rwandas or Somalias of the world, I mean the United States as a failing state that cannot deliver security at a level that people need. That means that our own civil society organizations have to take that burden on themselves. For example, in the southern border, if you close that border, if you militarize it, you create all sorts of perverse incentives that create insecurity. Whereas if you keep it very open, with a lot of movement backwards and forwards, you have the maximum possibility for civil society conducting surveillance and controlling the movement of what goes across the border backwards and forwards. So, you know, that's a sort of abstract level. At the sort of very practical level, there are so many opportunities these days for people who are starting out in their careers, both in the for-profit and the non-profit sector, to contribute, and so many choices they can make along the way. I just urge them again to be completely fearless, figure out their values, find mentors. Mentors are tremendously important. I mean, I know they were critical to me, and I'm forever indebted to this campus for providing them. And just don't take no for an answer. Just keep on going.
Peter, on that note, and thank you very much for sharing this conversation on your intellectual journey and how one effectively maintains their political activism and idealism in a globalized world. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks, Harry.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.